Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before a 7-year-old girl's heart stopped beating in his hands. St. Michael's Hospital in San Diego hums with fluorescent lights and antiseptic that coats the back of Elena Martinez's throat like chalk. The night shift pediatric wing is quiet at 11:08 p.m., the way hospitals are quiet before they explode. She moves through the corridors with hands that never tremble, prepping a 22 gauge for a post-op cardiac patient in room 312, her movements economical and precise. The needle slides into the port on the first attempt. She doesn't need to look twice. Muscle memory. 11 years of nights like this, though Caldwell's records show only 6 months at this hospital, and before that, nothing. A gap that would make normal people nervous. Elena touches the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket once, just once, when no one is watching. The metal is cool. Real. The only proof of who she used to be, hidden beneath folded scrubs in a locker that smells like bleach and her own small rebellion. The intercom crackles at midnight, incoming pediatric consult, ophthalmology, 3 minutes. Elena is already moving toward triage. She has learned to anticipate what hospitals need before they ask. Commander Williams arrives with his daughter Sophie, age 7, walking slowly because the child cannot see the floor beneath her feet. His uniform is dress blues, navy insignia on the collar, the kind of posture that comes from 30 years of commands given and followed. Sophie wears a pink hospital bracelet and holds her father's hand with the grip of someone who has already learned the world is not safe. Her eyes are open but empty, not white-filmed like cataracts, but unfocused, the pupils dilated and listless. Progressive blindness since birth. 2 years of specialists at Walter Reed. 6 months of experimental treatments at Johns Hopkins. And now her father has brought her to St. Michael's because her vision is failing faster and something in the files suggests Dr. Caldwell has experience with pediatric retinal conditions. The lie fits perfectly into hospital records because Caldwell types it himself. Elena kneels to Sophie's eye level, her movements fluid, unthreatening. She does not use the saccharine voice that most nurses reserve for children. "Sophie. I'm Elena. Can you tell me what you saw yesterday?" The girl's small fingers tighten on her father's hand. "Nothing," Sophie whispers. "Same as today. Same as always." "That's good information," Elena says, and she means it. She has already noticed from the chart that Caldwell documented 3 consultations over the past month that don't appear in the hospital's actual procedure logs. No patients matching those dates. No notes in the ophthalmology department. Just billing codes and phantom consultations at $650 each. She will ask about this later, in a way that doesn't threaten anything yet, just information gathering. Just a nurse asking questions about protocols. The kind of questions that make Dr. Caldwell's jaw tighten at the nurse's station as he watches her from behind the computer terminal, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. Caldwell is 48 years old and wears an Omega Seamaster that costs $12,000. He has cultivated 3 board members through golf course handshakes and favorable billing decisions. He has been padding pediatric consultations for 18 months, each phantom visit generating $650 in insurance claims, approximately $14,000 a month in pure fraud. This job at St. Michael's was supposed to be his final rotation before he transitioned to private practice in Scottsdale, Arizona, where the board members have property. Easy money. Calculated risk. And then Elena Martinez arrived on the night shift, asking about treatment protocols with the kind of steady focus that suggests she has read the files in their entirety, not just skimmed them. Asking why certain diagnoses don't match previous imaging results. Asking whether Dr. Caldwell had reviewed the patient's medication interactions before recommending the current regimen. She asks like someone who knows what she is looking at. Caldwell watches her kneel beside Sophie, watches the child's fingers relax slightly because Elena's hands are steady and her voice carries the cadence of someone accustomed to being trusted in moments of extremity. The child cannot see her, but children sense authority the way animals sense weather changes. Elena retrieves Sophie's file from the tablet, her eye scanning the documented consultations with the precision of someone reading a combat after-action report, dates, times, procedures, outcomes. Her jaw clamps once, almost invisible, then releases. "Commander Williams," Elena says, standing. "Has Dr. Caldwell examined Sophie in person before tonight?" Williams shifts his weight. He reviewed her charts. Recommended this appointment based on previous test results. Elena nods slowly. "I'll make sure he knows she's here. Let me get Sophie settled in exam room 4. She touches the child's shoulder with 2 fingers, so light Sophie almost doesn't feel it. "We're going to get you some answers, Sophie. Real ones." The exam room smells like latex gloves and the faint chemical burn of disinfectant. Elena moves with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from having operated in far less sterile environments. She positions the equipment for Sophie's eye pressure scan, adjusts the lighting to minimize the child's anxiety, explains each step before she performs it. The machine is going to beep. It doesn't hurt. It just measures how hard your eyes are working. Sophie nods, her small hands gripping the chair arms. Elena's hands don't shake. Her voice doesn't waver. The trembling that other people carry in moments like this, that uncertainty that bleeds through, doesn't exist in her. The trembling was something she learned to excise long ago, in places where trembling meant death. Dr. Caldwell arrives at 12:34 a.m. He moves through the hospital corridors the way certain men move through the world, occupying space, displacing it, demanding accommodation. He wears surgical scrubs that are probably for show, since he hasn't performed actual surgery in 14 months. His hair is dark and styled in a way that suggests hourly grooming. He stops at the nurse's station where Elena is documenting Sophie's initial assessment, and he leans against the counter in a posture meant to convey casual authority. "Martinez. I'll take it from here." Elena continues documenting. Her handwriting is small and precise. "I've completed the initial assessment. Visual acuity appears consistent with progressive retinal degeneration. The chart shows 3 previous consultations, but I don't see procedure notes or imaging correlations from those visits." Caldwell's jaw tightens. "That's not your concern. The protocol requires imaging for any pediatric retinal case." "I said it's not your concern." Elena turns to look at him directly. The eye contact lasts exactly 2 seconds, long enough for Caldwell to realize he is being evaluated by someone with training in threat assessment. She says nothing. She simply continues documenting, her pen moving across the chart with the same mechanical precision as before, but now Caldwell can feel the weight of what she is not saying. A nurse who asks about protocols. A nurse who reads files. A nurse who will notice, eventually, that his consulting room logs don't match his billing submissions. A nurse who will talk to someone else about noticing. A nurse who threatens everything. 2 floors up, in room for 87, a Marine lies in traction with a training accident injury, fractured tibia and complications from a 40-foot fall during a halo jump simulation at Camp Leshan. His name is Gator Holloway, and he has Elena Martinez's name tattooed on his forearm in ink the color of old blood. He has told the night shift nurse that the tattoo is classified, which is partially true. When Elena enters the room at 2:15 a.m. to change his dressings, he stares at her face, searching for recognition, and sees only the composed expression of a professional nurse checking his support and adjusting the bear hugger warming blanket that keeps him from shivering in the hospital cold. She doesn't introduce herself by first name. She doesn't pause. She doesn't acknowledge the tattoo visible where his sleeve rides up during the dressing change. She moves with the same steady precision she brings to every patient, and when she leaves the room, Gator Holloway lies in the darkness wondering if he is losing his mind, because he has been looking for this woman for 3 years, and when he finally found her, she was just a nurse changing bandages and checking vital signs as if they had never shared a bunker in Fallujah. As if she had never pulled him from beneath 2 tons of concrete while rounds punched through plaster and dust hung in the air like smoke from burning city. Elena wears a slight limp on her left side, barely noticeable unless someone watches her walk the same corridor twice. Soft tissue injury that healed wrong. Or healed deliberately wrong, in a way that created a pattern that doesn't quite match her medical records because her medical records are fiction. Everything in her file is designed to deflect attention: 6 months of employment history that can be verified, references who will confirm it, a social security number that passes verification, a driver's license from Nevada with an address that is real and empty. Nothing to suggest that Elena Martinez disappeared from her old life for years ago, that the woman who arrived at St. Michael's in September is actually someone rebuilt in the deliberate absence of documentation. The Master Chief Petty Officer rank, the 3 deployments to Fallujah, the extraction of 12 Marines from a collapsing structure during a black operation that was officially erased, none of that exists in any searchable database. No official record. No pension. No benefits. Just a name and a network of people who remember what she did, and a few who owe her their lives. She touches the challenge coin in her pocket at 3:11 a.m., when the night shift stretches longest and the hospital finally achieves the kind of quiet that only comes before dawn. The coin is military memorabilia, worthless to anyone except the person who earned it. She earned it by pulling 3 Marines through hostile fire in a city that no longer has its original name on any American map. The image on the coin has worn smooth with handling, tarnished silver, almost black in certain light. When she touches it, her heart rate doesn't increase. Her hands don't shake. But something in her shoulders relaxes, a muscle memory of identity that exists outside of this hospital, outside of Elena Martinez, outside of the carefully constructed fiction of normal life. The morning shift arrives at 6:33 a.m. Dr. Caldwell has been awake for 16 hours straight because he didn't sleep. He spent the hours between 2 o'clock and 6:44 a.m. considering his options and narrowing them down to one: Elena Martinez needs to be gone. Not transferred. Gone. A resignation, a termination for cause, a reason that is large enough and public enough that asking questions about his billing becomes impossible because no one will be asking questions about anyone. The cafeteria at 7:14 a.m. is where he makes his move. Elena is standing in line, holding a tray with black coffee and a Greek yogurt. Breakfast is fuel, not pleasure. Caldwell approaches her from behind and speaks loud enough that the room can hear. $200, he says. That's what I'm betting. You won't last a week. $200 that says you quit before Friday. Elena doesn't turn around. She continues toward the register. I'm serious, sweetheart, Caldwell says, and his voice carries the kind of edge that makes the surgical residents and floor nurses stop talking. $200. What do you say? You believe in yourself that much? Elena sets down her tray and turns to face him. Her expression is neutral, the kind of neutral that reads as ice to people trained to recognize it. I'm not a betting person. Smart, Caldwell says, and he smiles. He actually smiles. His hand comes up, and for a moment everyone in the cafeteria sees the tray tip, her tray, the one with the yogurt and the coffee, sees it lift and rotate and fall. The yogurt container hits her chest first, bursts, and explodes white across her scrubs. The coffee follows in a brown cascade that runs down to her shoes. The tray clatters. The room goes silent in the way that rooms do when they witness something they know is irreversible. Caldwell leans down and drops her chart on the floor. Hard. The pages scatter. Pick that up, sweetheart. Let's see how long that composure lasts. Elena doesn't move. She doesn't look down at the mess. She doesn't look at the scattered chart. She looks at Caldwell directly, and the room experiences a moment where the air pressure changes, subtle, but unmistakable. When she finally speaks, her voice is so quiet that people at the far end of the cafeteria have to strain to hear it. I'll clean this up. She kneels. She picks up the chart pages one by one. The yogurt has soaked into 3 pages, making the text run and blur. Coffee pools in the corner of the cafeteria tile. She is aware of the surgical residents watching. Aware of the 2 anesthesiologists frozen mid-conversation. Aware of the radiology technician with her mouth slightly open. Aware of Dr. Caldwell standing above her, waiting to see the crack in her composure, the moment when her jaw clenches too hard or her hands tremble or something in her face betrays the humiliation that normal people experience when they are treated like this in front of their colleagues. But Elena's hands don't tremble. Her jaw clenches once, so quick it could almost be missed, and then releases. She stands, holding the damp pages against her chest. Her scrubs are soaked. Her shoes are dripping. Her expression shows nothing. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, she says to no one in particular, to everyone in the room. "I need to change." She doesn't look at Caldwell as she passes him. She doesn't acknowledge his smile or the small victory he believes he has just won. She moves through the cafeteria the way a soldier moves through a hostile area, aware of everything, threatened by nothing, her presence somehow filling the space even as she leaves it. When she reaches the locker room, Elena removes the soaked scrubs and stands in the fluorescent light, her arms bare, and in the soft light someone might notice the scars across her shoulders and ribs if they were looking closely. Someone might notice the way her left leg bears the kind of muscle damage that comes from trauma, not accident. Someone might notice the calluses on her hands, not the soft hands of a nurse, but the hard hands of someone who has carried weight that shouldn't be carried by human beings. But no one is looking closely. No one is watching the lockers. Elena touches the tarnished challenge coin one more time, and she breathes. The morning staff meeting at St. Michael's began like every other Wednesday, fluorescent lights humming their electric monotone, 23 people in scrubs arranged around a conference table that smelled of stale coffee and hand sanitizer. Dr. Caldwell sat at the head like a judge presiding, his tailored white coat catching light that made him look polished, untouchable. Elena stood at the back near the door with her coffee, black, no sugar, her posture perfect, her hands completely still. Caldwell's voice cut through the routine updates about bed capacity and staffing rotations. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him like a predator settling into dominance. "I'll bet $200 the new night nurse quits within a week. Anyone want to take that action?" The room went silent. Not pause for thought silent. Dead silent. The kind of silence that happens when someone says something they shouldn't and everyone freezes to see what happens next. Elena's knuckles whitened against her coffee cup. That was the only visible reaction. Nothing in her face shifted. Her breathing remained steady, measured, controlled, the breathing of someone who had learned long ago that showing pain was a weakness enemies could exploit. The scar tissue along her forearm, hidden beneath her sleeve, seemed to pulse with old muscle memory. Caldwell continued, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. "These bleeding hearts never last. Too much empathy, not enough spine. Give her a week, she'll be crying in some supply closet about the injustice of the world." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room, the kind of laughter people make when they sense danger but are too afraid to resist. Caldwell smiled. He had an audience. He had power. He had no idea that the woman at the back of the room had held dying Marines in her arms while enemy fire shredded concrete 3 inches from her head. Elena took a slow sip of her coffee and set the cup down on the nearest table with a soft clink. She turned and walked out of the conference room. Not hurried. Not slow. Just a woman moving through space, as if the bet had never been made, as if $200 and her reputation weren't just offered up like a poker chip on a table in front of 40 nurses and residents and lab technicians who would spend the next 8 hours discussing whether she'd actually last. She knew how this worked. Humiliation was a tool, and tools only worked if the target reacted. She had learned that lesson in Fallujah when insurgents tried to break her during 3 days of interrogation, that showing fear fed the machine, made it stronger, made it hungrier. Stoicism was armor. Silence was a weapon. That afternoon, the cafeteria at St. Michael's was crowded with the lunch rush, residents grabbing protein bars between surgeries, nurses stealing 15 minutes before the afternoon chaos, administrators talking in low voices about budget cuts and insurance codes. Elena sat alone at a table near the window with a salad and her patient notes, reviewing Sophie Williams' chart while she ate. Sophie. 7 years old. Vision deteriorating since birth. Progressive optic nerve atrophy documented for 18 months. Caldwell's treatment plan, observation and comfort care. No specialist referrals. No second opinions. No escalation of care. The entries made no sense. A child losing her sight and the recommended intervention was waiting. Elena had held enough casualties in field hospitals to know that when something progressed that fast, the answer was always move, act, escalate. Wait meant accept the outcome. And the outcome for Sophie was blindness by age 12. Elena closed the chart and made her decision. It took her exactly 2 seconds to stand up, walk to the pediatric wing small conference area where the morning rounds team was eating, and find Dr. Caldwell leaning against the counter with a sandwich in one hand and a coffee in the other, talking to the cardiology fellow about golf handicaps. Her voice was steady when she spoke. Not loud. Just clear. Dr. Caldwell, Sophie Williams needs a second opinion. Maybe UCLA. Someone in neuro-ophthalmology. The room went quiet. Not the shocked quiet of the staff meeting. This was the quiet of someone watching a smaller animal approach a larger one. Caldwell's head turned slowly, deliberately, as if he were already composing his response before his eyes even focused on her. He set his sandwich down on the counter with the precision of someone placing a blade. Then he walked directly to her, closing the distance until he was standing close enough that his shadow fell across her face. Martinez, right? His voice was low, calculated. Let me explain how this works. I've been practicing medicine since before you learned to take a temperature. He reached past her toward the salad she'd left at the nearby table and knocked her lunch tray to the floor. The plastic clattered. Food scattered across the white tile in a pattern that almost looked deliberate, apple slices, dressing, lettuce spreading like debris from an explosion. The cafeteria froze. Not gradually. Instantly. 40 people stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped breathing in the way that happens when someone has just crossed a line that society pretends doesn't exist in professional environments. Elena's jaw clenched once, visible enough to be honest, controlled enough to be disciplined. She didn't step back. She didn't look away. She looked at him with eyes that showed absolutely nothing. Caldwell dropped Sophie's patient chart at her feet. The paper scattered across the tiles, landing among the apple slices and spilled coffee. Pick that up, sweetheart. While you're down there, maybe you'll find where you left your medical degree. He turned away as if the moment was finished, as if he had won a contest that Elena hadn't agreed to enter. She knelt. That was the moment, the one that would circle through the hospital in whispers for weeks. The moment when she got down on her hands and knees on the cafeteria floor and began gathering the papers with hands that didn't shake, that didn't fumble, that moved with the kind of certainty that belongs to someone who has retrieved vital equipment from rubble under fire. Her movements were economical. Nothing wasted. No emotion visible. She retrieved every page. She retrieved the apple slices. She made eye contact with Dr. Caldwell for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register the confusion in his face, the surprise that his blow hadn't landed the way he expected. Then she stood and walked to the disposal area to clean the mess. The sound of paper towels being pulled from the dispenser was the only noise in the cafeteria. Rubber gloves snapped as she pulled them on. Then silence again. That night, during rounds, Caldwell found her checking Sophie's vitals and called her Florence Nightingale in front of Commander Williams. Our night nurse has such maternal instincts. Probably better that she's not making the real clinical decisions here. Don't you worry, Commander. Your daughter's in good hands with someone who actually has credentials. Commander Williams' jaw tightened. He was a man trained to assess threats and make decisions under pressure, and something in the way Elena had moved, precise, purposeful, completely unaffected by the insult, registered as something other than what Caldwell was describing. But he said nothing. Elena continued checking Sophie's blood pressure as if Caldwell hadn't spoken. Her hand moved to her pocket during the vital signs check, fingers brushing the tarnished military challenge coin she kept there, the one stamped with insignia she could never explain, the one that connected her to 3 Marines and an identity she was supposed to have erased. Pain is information, her training had taught her. Humiliation is just pain with an audience. Both could be processed. Both could be filed away. Both could be used later. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what would change everything. Because in 48 hours, Sophie would crash during a routine ophthalmologic exam, and every specialist in that pediatric department would freeze while a 7-year-old girl flatlined on an examination table. And the woman they had just watched kneel on a cafeteria floor would move. The examination room on the 4th floor smelled like antiseptic and fear. Sophie Williams lay on the pediatric examination table, her small frame dwarfed by the machinery around her, her unseeing eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the fluorescent panels. She was 7 years old. Blind since birth. And according to the chart Dr. Caldwell held with his manicured fingers, progressively losing what little light perception she'd managed to retain. Commander Williams stood at his daughter's shoulder, his dress blues crisp enough to cut glass, his jaw set in the way of men who'd learned to control their expressions in rooms where emotion was weakness. He watched Caldwell with the intensity of someone who understood hierarchy and protocol. He didn't know that the man holding his daughter's medical fate had been padding consultation bills for 18 months. He didn't know that the steady-handed nurse in the corner, the one in the wrinkled scrubs who'd arrived with a fresh kit and said nothing, was tracking every move Caldwell made. Elena stood by the vital signs monitor, her posture a study in deference. Shoulders slightly rounded. Eyes down. The perfect subordinate. Her hands were already wrapped in latex, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the procedure. She'd read Sophie's chart at 2:11 a.m. during the night shift, had traced the progression of the child's condition with the clinical eye of someone trained to see what others missed. Progressive optic nerve atrophy. Medication regimen unchanged in 14 months. Visual field deteriorating at an accelerating rate. The notations were sparse, Caldwell's handwriting scrawled across the margin in a way that suggested he'd spent approximately 90 seconds reviewing the case. Just a routine assessment, Caldwell was saying, his voice carrying the rehearsed warmth of a man who performed concern the way actors delivered lines. We'll check the optic nerve response, measure the visual fields, maybe adjust the medication if needed. Sophie's voice was small. Will it hurt? Not at all, sweetheart. Caldwell pulled the penlight from his pocket, and Elena watched him lean in toward the child's face. She'd seen him move this way before, seen the precision he used when patients were watching. Different when he was alone. Different when he thought no one was tracking the phantom consultations, the billing codes for specialists who'd never examined a single case. The first vital signs came through clean. Heart rate 74. Oxygen saturation 98%. Blood pressure 1/62. Textbook pediatric normal. Elena's jaw worked once as she watched the numbers cycle across the monitor. Something was off. Not obvious. Not measurable. Not yet. Caldwell was 3 minutes into the examination when it started. The monitor's rhythm shifted, a single extra beat, then another. The heart rate climbed to 86. 92. Elena's shoulders straightened by half an inch, the only outward signal that her attention had narrowed to a single point. She's fine, Caldwell said without looking at the monitor. Anxiety is normal in pediatric patients. The rate hit 108. 120. 130. Elena took a single step forward. Doctor, her rate is. I have it. Caldwell's voice had shifted, acquired an edge. He was looking at Sophie now, watching her face, and Elena saw what he saw. The child's breathing had become shallow. Rapid. The kind of breathing that bodies did when they were drowning in their own autonomic system. 140. 150. 160. Sophie, honey, can you tell me how you feel? Commander Williams moved to the table, his hand finding his daughter's shoulder. Sophie's response came in gasps. Can't. Breathe. Right. 170. 180. The monitors were screaming now, a cascade of alarms that painted the room in red digital light. Caldwell stepped back from the examination table, his face gone pale in a way that made him look suddenly older, suddenly like a man who'd realized he'd missed something critical. The pediatric resident, a young woman named Dr. Chen, was already moving toward the door to call for help when the monitor's rhythm flatlined into a single devastating tone. A tone that meant nothing. A tone that meant everything. Sophie Williams' heart had stopped. The room froze. Not metaphorically. Actually froze. Dr. Chen's hand was still extended toward the door. Caldwell's mouth was open around words that would never form. A nurse, the one who'd been checking the medication drip, had gone absolutely still, her eyes locked on the monitor screen as if staring at it hard enough could rewrite what the numbers were telling her. 7 years old. Blind since birth. Now flatlined on an examination table in a room full of specialists who were trained for exactly this moment and suddenly had no idea what to do. The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then Elena moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce what she was doing. She simply crossed the examination room, her gloved hands already reaching for the sterile field, and she said, "Emergency thoracotomy tray. Now. Get the anesthesia cart." The surgical resident, a man named Hoffman who'd trained under trauma surgeons at Johns Hopkins, watched Elena's hands move and stepped back without argument. The tray was there in 20 seconds. Scalpel. Clamps. The instruments arranged with the kind of precision that came from knowing exactly what you'd need and in what order you'd need it. Elena's hands moved like they were wired to something ancient and certain, like they'd done this before in places that left scars but didn't leave records. She made the incision with a single clean stroke, the anterolateral thoracotomy, left side, between the 4th and 5th ribs. The blade moved through skin and muscle and fascia with the kind of sureness that made Dr. Hoffman's breath catch. She wasn't hesitating. She wasn't checking. She was moving like a woman who'd held this exact knowledge in her muscle memory for longer than Sophie Williams had been alive. Blood. The smell of copper and open tissue. The hiss of the cavity opening as she spread the ribs with a Finocchietto retractor, the metal clicking into place with a sound like a rifle round chambering. The heart was in front of her now, a small organ, the size of a child's closed fist, purple dark and still. Elena's hands went in. Direct cardiac massage. Her fingers wrapped around the left ventricle, and she began to compress, her hands moving with a rhythm that was nothing like the gentle CPR they taught in civilian courses. This was military trauma medicine. This was what you did when you had 90 seconds to restart something before the brain began to die. For minutes was the window. For minutes of clinical death before the damage became permanent. Elena knew this the way she knew how to field strip an M16 or navigate by the stars. 1 minute. Sophie's monitor remained a flat line. Caldwell had found his voice and was calling for medications, but his voice sounded distant, belonged to some other person in some other room. Elena's hands continued their rhythm, mechanical and precise as a metronome. 2 minutes. Someone had pushed 1 milligram of epinephrine for push. The drug was in Sophie's system now, traveling through vessels smaller than guitar strings, searching for the chemical key that would unlock the heart's electrical system. 3 minutes. Elena's hands were steady. Her breathing steady. Her focus narrowed to the feel of the heart under her palms, the compression pattern, the sense of blood being forced through coronary arteries that had gone silent. In her mind she was in Fallujah, in a Marine Battalion aid station, her hands doing exactly this while the sound of small arms fire rattled the corrugated metal roof like a tin can being kicked. "Push another epi," she said. Her voice had changed. Lost its deference. Acquired the weight of someone who didn't ask, who commanded. Hoffman moved immediately. For minutes. Elena's hands began to feel the first small flutter under her palms. A single beat. Irregular. Barely worth noting. But a beat. "Come on, Sophie," Elena said quietly. "Come on." The monitor showed sinus rhythm suddenly, a thin green line with regular peaks. 60 beats per minute. 62. The line climbed, stabilized, held. Sophie Williams' heart was beating again. The room didn't explode. No one shouted. Instead there was the sound of collective breath being released, the kind of silence that came after a disaster had been averted by something that shouldn't have been possible. Dr. Chen was on her radio calling for ICU bed assignment. Hoffman was staring at Elena's hands with an expression of absolute shock, as if he'd watched a nurse reach into a child's chest and pull a miracle out by force of will alone. Elena was already reaching for the suture kit, her movements automatic, her hands beginning to close what she'd opened. Sophie was alive. That was the only metric that mattered. Everything else was just repair work. 20 minutes later, Sophie was moving toward the ICU with a full pediatric trauma team, her small body swaddled in blankets and monitor leads, her father's hand gripping the stretcher frame as he walked beside her. Commander Williams had looked at Elena once when the stretcher was rolling past, and his eyes had held a question that he didn't ask. His daughter was alive because a nurse had performed an emergency surgical procedure with the precision of someone who'd done it before. Somewhere. Somehow. Elena stripped off her gloves in the sink, watching the latex drift into the trash. Her hands were steady. No tremor. No sign of the adrenaline that must have been flooding her system. She'd learned long ago that the body kept secrets if you demanded it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 3:15 p.m. when Dr. Caldwell called the chief of medical staff. The worst part came at 3:27 p.m. when a man named Morrison arrived at St. Michael's carrying a leather briefcase, a credential auditor's cold eyes, and questions about employment gaps that didn't have explanations. The worst part came at 4:22 p.m. when Caldwell appeared at Elena's new assignment on the orthopedic floor, a floor 2 buildings away, a deliberate distance that ensured she couldn't check on Sophie, couldn't see what happened next, and handed her a reassignment notice printed on hospital letterhead. The notice listed violations. Exceeded scope of practice. Performed surgical procedure without supervision. Falsified employment history. Elena read it once. Folded it. Put it in her pocket. This will be investigated, Caldwell said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd already made 3 phone calls to board members who owed him favors. Completely by the book. Elena nodded. Said nothing. Reported to her new floor and spent the rest of her shift doing orthopedic post-operative checks, changing bandages, checking vitals on patients recovering from knee replacements and hip repairs. Routine work. Work that required no decisions. Work that required her to be invisible. At 11:24 p.m., when her shift ended, she walked to the parking garage. The San Diego night was cool, carrying the salt smell of the Pacific that rolled in through the canyon every evening. She found her car, opened the driver's side door, and sat in the darkness with the engine off, her forehead against the steering wheel. There was nowhere left to run. She'd already run once, 3 years ago, when the assignment ended and the Pentagon offered her a new identity and a discharge that was buried in so many classified files that she'd stopped expecting it to ever surface. She'd taken a nursing certificate from an online program. She'd built a new name out of her grandmother's maiden name and her mother's first name. She'd created a person who'd never carried a rifle, never stormed a building in Fallujah, never pulled a Marine through 2 kilometers of hostile fire while his blood soaked into the sleeves of her uniform. Now that person was being erased, document by document, question by question. Elena pressed her forehead harder against the steering wheel. Her hands were perfectly still against the steering column. Her breathing was perfectly controlled. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She sat in the darkness of the parking garage and understood with absolute clarity that the only identity she had left was about to be taken from her, and there was no third version of herself to become. Dr. Caldwell's office door slammed hard enough that the frosted glass rattled. His hands were shaking as he lowered himself into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight like an animal in pain. For minutes. That was how long Elena Martinez had stood at that child's chest with her hands inside the girl's ribs, performing a procedure that belonged in a trauma bay during a Marine Corps convoy ambush, not in a routine ophthalmologic exam at St. Michael's Hospital in San Diego. The other physicians had frozen. The surgical resident had actually stepped backward, his mouth open like a man watching something impossible unfold in real time. Caldwell's mind raced through the implications with the precision of a man whose entire constructed life was collapsing in slow motion. The billing fraud would hold up, 18 months of phantom consultations, carefully documented, buried in legitimate cases. But this This was a nurse, without a physician's order, without authorization, cracking open a child's chest with her bare hands and knowing exactly where to place them. That kind of expertise didn't come from a standard nursing degree. That kind of hands-on cardiac competency came from somewhere else entirely. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the first number from memory. Golf course handshakes. That's how power actually worked in healthcare administration. Rounds at Torrey Pines, drinks at the club, conversations that never appeared in any official record. Board member Harrison picked up on the third ring. "James, it's Caldwell. We have a situation at the hospital." His voice was steady now, controlled, modulated into the tone of a concerned physician rather than a panicked administrator. One of our nursing staff exceeded her scope of practice during a pediatric emergency. Performed an invasive procedure without authorization. I'm concerned about credentialing issues and patient safety. He waited for the response. Harrison was a retired orthopedic surgeon with enough hospital board experience to understand the implications. Scope violations were serious. They meant liability. They meant Joint Commission investigations. "Who's the nurse?" Harrison asked. "Elena Martinez. Night shift. She's only been with us for 6 months. No prior issues noted, but I'm having some concerns about her background verification. I'll talk to the credentials committee. We need to move carefully here. If there's a real safety issue, we're obligated to report. But you're right to flag it." Caldwell hung up and made the second call. Board member Whitmore, a cardiologist with connections to the state medical board. Same message, different angle. "I'm concerned about inadequate supervision and a possible credentialing gap. I think we need an external review." The third call went to an investigator named Morrison, a retired detective who did background checks for hospitals. Caldwell had used him before. He was thorough, and he understood how to frame things. "Morrison, I need a full credential verification on one of our nurses. Elena Martinez. She's been here 6 months, but I'm seeing some inconsistencies in her employment history. Her previous hospital lists only a 6-month tenure. Before that, there's a gap, almost a year unaccounted for. I need to know where she was, what she was doing, whether those credentials are legitimate. I can have preliminary findings in 48 hours, Morrison said. Where should I focus? The gap. Find out what she was doing during that time. And verify her references at her previous hospital. I want to know if they're real people or if someone did her a favor with paperwork." By the time Caldwell hung up the phone, he had set something in motion that felt inevitable and unstoppable. A nurse who performed unauthorized procedures. A credentialing gap. An external investigator with a very specific directive. The narrative was already written. All that was left was for the investigation to confirm it. But that wasn't the worst part. Morrison moved fast. He called back 36 hours later with preliminary findings that made Caldwell's chest tighten with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been fear. The previous hospital had verified Elena's employment, but only barely. They'd released records that showed exactly what Caldwell had suspected, a 6-month contract position, no permanent hire, and before that, nothing. No employment record. No explanation. A gap that stretched across almost 11 months. It's unusual, Morrison said, his voice carrying the professional neutrality of a man who had seen a lot of unusual things. Her current certifications are valid. Her nursing license is clean. But that employment gap is a red flag. People don't just disappear for a year without explanation. Either she was unemployed, or her previous work wasn't civilian employment. Caldwell understood what Morrison wasn't saying. Military. The gap pattern matched military leave, military transition, military reassignment. But if that were the case, it would have shown up in her background check. Unless it was sealed. Unless it was classified. Unless someone very high up had made sure it didn't. The thought made him recalculate everything. But the investigation was already moving. Morrison filed his report 70 hours after Sophie's cardiac arrest, citing employment inconsistencies, unverifiable gaps, and performance metrics that exceeded what a standard nursing degree would support. The report ended with a single recommendation: credential review and possible disciplinary action pending further investigation. The hospital administrator called an emergency credentialing committee meeting. Caldwell attended, presented his concerns as a physician worried about patient safety, and watched the board members read Morrison's report with expressions that ranged from concern to outright alarm. No one mentioned the phantom consultations. No one brought up the billing fraud. The focus stayed exactly where Caldwell wanted it, on Elena's background, her gaps, her unexplained expertise. "We need to suspend her privileges pending investigation," the board chair said. It wasn't a question. Immediate suspension, Caldwell agreed. "She's already been reassigned away from the pediatric unit. But I think for patient safety, we need to put her on administrative leave while we verify her credentials." The vote was unanimous. 5 minutes of discussion. A motion. A second. Done. Security came to Elena's station at 03 for 7 hours on day 3. 2 officers, professional but not unkind. Elena was finishing her shift report when they found her, and she looked up at them with absolutely no expression on her face. "Ms. Martinez, you need to come with us to HR." The guard's voice carried the awkwardness of a man who had done this before but never enjoyed it. Elena followed them without asking questions. She didn't tremor. She didn't demand explanations. She simply stood, clocked out, and walked with them to the HR office where a termination letter waited on the desk, already signed by the administrator. Insubordination. Credentialing fraud. Performance exceeding documented qualifications. Falsified employment history. Her hospital badge was deactivated at 03 for 8 hours. She was escorted to her locker, watched while she emptied it into a cardboard box that smelled like old fruit and broken dreams. A security photograph was taken, Elena in her scrubs, cardboard box under her arm, walking toward the exit with her shoulders level and her jaw set like stone. No tears. Not even a flicker of emotion visible on her face. But later, when she was alone in her car in the parking garage, something inside her finally broke. The engine was dead, the keys in her lap. Her forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The tarnished challenge coin sat on the dashboard, the only object in the world that proved she had ever been anything other than a night shift nurse at a San Diego hospital who had just been fired for lying on a job application she had filled out with nothing but the truth. 20 minutes. Her shoulders shook once, a movement like a sniper's breath between shots. Just once. Then stillness again. Rain had started outside, hammering against the windshield in a rhythm that sounded like applause or like a countdown or like the sound of a door closing on every possible escape route she had ever considered. She had run before. From Fallujah to Fort Coronado to a borrowed identity to a hospital night shift that was supposed to be invisible. She had thought she could keep running, keep becoming someone new, keep disappearing into the background of other people's lives like smoke dissolving into open air. She had been wrong about that. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. Steady hands. Hands that had held lives together in a collapsed building in Jolin district while rounds came through windows. Hands that had sewn up wounds in a medical tent when the proper supplies never arrived. Hands that had performed direct cardiac massage on a 7-year-old girl with blind eyes and a father's prayers. Those hands had just lost the last identity she had. The parking garage was silent except for the rain. Above her, somewhere in the ICU, Sophie Williams was deteriorating. Caldwell had taken over her care personally. Elena had seen the medication chart before she was escorted out, dosages adjusted upward, timing intervals shortened, pharmaceutical precision applied in ways that violated every protocol Elena had memorized from her training manual because protocols were written by people who wanted patients to survive. There was a text on her phone from a resident named Dr. Patel, someone Elena had mentored during night shifts. "Sophie's crashing again. Caldwell won't listen. We're losing her." Elena sat in the dark with her forehead against the wheel and understood that she had one choice left. She could turn the key. She could drive away. She could let the system work the way systems always worked, which was to protect people like Caldwell and destroy people like her. Or she could walk back into that hospital with her head level and her hand steady and save that child one more time, consequences be damned. She picked up the challenge coin from the dashboard. Held it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. The coin went into her pocket. Her badge, the one they thought they had deactivated, was still around her neck. The night shift guard at the security desk was Navy, 30 years retired, and something in Elena's bearing made him understand without words being spoken. He didn't call out. He didn't report her entry. The stairs to the ICU smelled like antiseptic and time running out. The investigation Morrison launched into Elena's credentials became a scalpel, and Dr. Caldwell turned it on himself. Within 48 hours of the board redirecting the external auditor's focus toward Caldwell's own pediatric consultation files, the pattern emerged like blood in saline solution. Phantom consultations. Patients Caldwell had never examined. Inflated procedure codes. A medical device supplier routing kickbacks through a shell company owned by his brother-in-law. 18 months of systematic fraud. $397,000. The kind of number that doesn't just disappear. The board members Caldwell had cultivated through golf games and country club handshakes immediately distanced themselves with the precision of rats abandoning a sinking ship. Their attorneys were already drafting statements claiming ignorance. None of them would take his calls. The hospital administrator, facing potential liability, had Morrison's audit handed directly to the state medical board and the FBI white-collar crime unit. It wasn't a choice. It was damage control. Commander Williams filed a formal complaint about the medication errors that nearly killed his daughter, supported by Elena's meticulous documentation and the testimony of 3 ICU nurses who finally felt safe enough to speak. The nurses described how Caldwell had instructed them to administer dosages that didn't match any documented protocol, how he'd ordered procedures Elena had flagged as unnecessary, how he dismissed her concerns with contempt every single time. One nurse had saved the emails. All of them. 2 years of email chains in a folder labeled for legal. The medical board suspended Caldwell's license pending criminal investigation. Not revoked. Suspended. The distinction meant something. It left a thread of possibility, a technicality his attorneys could work with. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal within 6 weeks, surrender his medical license permanently, repay the fraudulent billings in full plus penalties, avoid prison time in exchange for his cooperation regarding the device supplier's other hospital accounts across Southern California. It was the kind of deal that required him to disappear from medicine entirely. Not martyrdom. Not vindication. Just erasure. Elena learned about it from a text message from Lieutenant Chen, the Marine from room 487 whose arm bore her call sign tattooed in black ink. The news had been posted on the state medical board website. She'd been cleared of all charges. Her security escort was formally reversed. Her badge deactivation annulled. The hospital's sealed settlement included a confidentiality clause that meant she could never discuss the details publicly, but the record showed what mattered. She had been right. She didn't return to St. Michael's the next day. She didn't return the next week. Instead, she drove to Balboa Park at 2:38 p.m. on a Thursday in late March and sat on a bench overlooking the canyon, holding the folded termination notice in one hand, feeling the weight of it like it was written on lead rather than paper. A woman in a pink windbreaker jogged past. Someone's dog barked 3 blocks away. The air smelled like eucalyptus and the ghost of winter rain. Elena folded the paper smaller and smaller until it fit in her palm, then opened it again without unfolding it, just letting it sit there. She wasn't thinking about vindication. She was thinking about a 7-year-old girl who'd gripped her hand in the darkness of her own vision, asking questions about light. She was thinking about a man in room 487 who had her name written on his skin like a prayer he'd been saying every morning. 6 months later, Elena walked past a strip mall pharmacy in Mission Valley. The kind of pharmacy that shared space with a tax preparation service and a cell phone repair place. Outside, in the weak afternoon sun, someone had set up a folding table with a banner, "Supplemental Insurance Consultations, Free Quote." The kind of setup you see at community health fairs, except this one was permanent. There were brochures fanned across the table like promotional material for someone trying to sell second chances. Dr. Caldwell was sitting behind the table wearing a suit that cost approximately the price of a decent used Honda Civic. His face was the color of old concrete. His hands, which had once moved through operating rooms with the confidence of a man who believed consequences were for other people, were now shuffling through policy documents with the mechanical precision of a man counting down the days until retirement at 62. He looked up when Elena approached. Not because he recognized her footsteps or her silhouette. He looked up because the afternoon sun caught his eye and forced him to register movement. 3 seconds of eye contact. His brain processing. His jaw tightening by approximately 2 millimeters. His pupils dilating with recognition, not of who she was, but of what she represented. The consequence he'd calculated as acceptable loss now standing directly in front of him, asking nothing, wanting nothing, simply existing in the same space where he was trying to sell supplemental insurance to elderly women who didn't trust him and had no reason to. Elena didn't stop walking. There was nothing to say to him. No vindication to collect. No moment of triumph to extract. He was already dead, not literally, but in every way that mattered. He'd been erased from medicine. From authority. From the power structure he'd weaponized for 18 months. Now he was a man at a folding table explaining policy details to people who looked through him like he was glass. Elena walked past without breaking stride, without looking back, without giving him the satisfaction of a second thought. Sophie Williams was home now. Her heart repaired by the cardiothoracic surgeon who had reviewed Elena's emergency procedure and called it textbook emergency thoracotomy. Whoever trained this nurse trained them well. Her vision stabilized through the ocular ophthalmology specialist Elena had suggested months ago, before Caldwell had the chance to bury that recommendation under paperwork and contempt. The girl could see shapes now. Light. The outline of her father's face. She was learning that darkness wasn't permanent, that vision returned in increments, that the world existed beyond the borders of her own blindness. Lieutenant Chen finally recognized Elena during his discharge appointment at the medical clinic downtown. His eyes filled with something between tears and disbelief, and he reached for the tattoo on his forearm, the call sign in black ink, the one he'd been carrying since Fallujah, and said her name like a prayer he'd been saying every morning for 3 years without knowing if the woman behind the name was still alive. He was transferring to Camp Lejeune with his family. He brought her a photograph of his daughter sleeping in a hospital bassinet, a card that read, "She's here because you carried me," and the kind of gratitude that doesn't require words, just presence. Elena returned to St. Michael's 6 months after the board cleared her name. Not as a nurse rejoining the ICU rotation. Not as a consultant being quietly rehabilitated after a public humiliation. She arrived as the hospital's new combat trauma protocol coordinator, hired to develop and teach emergency thoracic procedures to residents who would listen with the reverence usually reserved for textbooks. The hospital's trauma director, a surgeon named Reeves who had quietly supported her throughout the investigation, met her at the entrance with a firm handshake and the words, "Welcome home, Master Chief." She didn't flinch. That chapter of her life, the hiding, the deferential voice, the steady hands masking what lay beneath, had closed when the board posted their findings. The training sessions happened in the simulation lab on the 3rd floor, where Elena taught emergency cricothyrotomy and emergency department thoracotomy using mannequins designed to bleed synthetic blood that stained just like the real thing. She taught needle decompression at the 2nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She taught the decision tree for when to push past protocol and when to push past fear. She taught them that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most authority. Commander Williams brought Sophie for a follow-up appointment on an afternoon when the sky was the exact shade of gray that comes right before rain. The 7-year-old girl moved through the hallway with the careful precision of someone learning to trust her vision again, her hand gripping Elena's hand with fierce determination. Sophie could see shapes now. Light. Shadows. The rough outline of Elena's smile. When her father said the words, "Thank you for your service." Sophie looked up at Elena and said them too, her voice small but certain. For the first time in 3 years, Elena didn't flinch. She didn't deflect or minimize or hide the truth of who she was. She said, "It was an honor." The words came out steady and certain, the voice of a woman who no longer needed to pretend that heroism was something that belonged to other people. The rain started then, soft at first, then harder, hammering against the hospital windows with the sound of applause. Sophie's father pulled his daughter close. Elena stood there in the pediatric ICU where she'd performed emergency cardiac massage on a child everyone else believed was already gone, and felt both versions of herself, Master Chief and Elena Martinez, settle into the same skin like they'd always belonged there. The challenge coin sat on her desk now, not hidden in a locker beneath folded scrubs. The veteran security guard, who served 30 years Navy, saluted her every morning with regulation-perfect precision. Lieutenant Chen sent her photographs from Camp Lejeune, his daughter's first birthday party, a cake with one candle shaped like the number 1, his wife's hand on his shoulder. The note attached read, "She exists because you carried me." "Thank you, Master Chief." Elena kept that photograph in her wallet, in the section where some people keep pictures of loved ones. She did too. This was how you honored the fallen, by remembering the ones who survived because you refused to let them disappear. The hospital administrator offered her a permanent position as trauma clinical coordinator, a bridge between civilian and veteran populations, a woman who understood both worlds because she'd lived in both simultaneously. Elena accepted. She stood in the pediatric ICU on her first day of formal employment, training a young nurse named Ramirez on emergency protocols, teaching her about pressure points and decision trees and the terrible mathematics of how long a human body can sustain itself without oxygen. Ramirez asked, "How did you stay so calm when everyone else froze?" Elena touched the challenge coin in her pocket, the one she no longer hid, and answered, "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most." Through the window behind them, Sophie Williams waved from her father's arms, her eyes tracking movement, tracking light, seeing Elena's silhouette against the fluorescent brightness. Elena waved back, and for the first time since Fallujah, she felt like both identities could exist in the same person without requiring erasure or apology. She'd stopped running. She was home. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Elena's position?